Hello everyone, my name is Courtney Martell, and for the purpose of this presentation, I will be talking about behavioral assessment methods. What are behavioral assessments? Behavioral assessment is an approach to focus on interactions that regard various situations involving behaviors for the purpose of having a change in that specific behavior. People do not engage in self-injury behaviors or aggressive behaviors solely because they have developmental disabilities. There is logic to their behavior, and functional assessment is an attempt to understand that logic. Some history of behavioral analysis. Well, behaviorism began in the 1930s. It rooted from Pavlov's classical conditioning, where functional behavior analysis was brought about from Skinner's work with stimulus-response learning. There have been a growing debate about clinical assessment and its development of effective treatments. Because of this, behavioral therapists look to creating an alternative in an attempt to resolve these issues. Their alternative was to focus on behaviors and the assessments of those behaviors. It's different from traditional assessments because behavioral assessment is interested in the samples of behavior, not as a sign of internal processes, where functional analysis is a very concrete method with used to understand a certain behavior. Assessment is ongoing and an active part of all the different stages of treatment, not just the final stage. What is the difference between a sample and a sign? Looking at the behavioral assessment, responses are looked at as a sample of the test subject's behavior, which are thought to be linked to other situations. In traditional assessment, test data is interpreted as a sign of their internal process. Functional analysis and assessment. Functional analysis is a process that is used in gathering information in order to determine the relationship between a person's problems and behavior, and as well as their environment that they're in. It's used to describe different methods that allow researchers to identify why the specific behavior is occurring. When you're aware of the specific purpose of the behavior, you're able to get a more in-depth intervention plan for that specific behavior. Before starting a functional analysis, there are some questions that have to be thought about. Does the student's behavior significantly differ from that of his or her classmates? Does the student's behavior lessen the possibility of successful learning for him or the students around them? Has past efforts to address the student's behavior been used? Have they been successful? In what ways have they been successful or unsuccessful? Is the student's behavior serious, chronic, or does it threaten the safety of him, others? Is there some disciplinary actions likely to occur in the result of this behavior? If any of these questions are answered yes, then a functional analysis plan is started. During this functional analysis plan, there are other questions that arise. Different variables should be collected. Time when the behavior does or does not occur. Does it happen during a particular subject or activity, or in a specific location of a building or environment? Conditions where the behavior does or does not occur. Does it happen when they're working in small groups, structured or unstructured times? Is it because they're alone or bored? Is the events or conditions that typically occur before the behavior? Does it happen right before a specific reading group or right before math? Does it happen after a specific behavior? Does the student get upset because something happened at a specific time during the day? Does it happen during common events like bad weather, thunderstorms? And are other behaviors associated with the problems? Is it because this person has had a series of negative peer interactions? These questions need to be looked at and answered while completing a functional analysis assessment. So when, why, and who creates the behavioral assessment? A behavioral assessment happens when a person's behavior interferes with their performance, progress, or interferes with the partition of their daily routine. It's used to help the individual who has problems with behaviors, and it helps them be able to cope with them and become successful in all circumstances of their daily life and routine. Who administers the behavioral assessment? A behavioral assessment is done by someone who is skilled in a FEA. They're able to perform, collaborate, and is able to effectively design and implement positive behavioral support strategies. Some functional assessment strategies and procedures include effective prevention, remediation, developmental, or alternative behaviors. Some procedures include review of records of previous interventions and results. Have some of the previous interventions worked and then are starting to not work and need to be changed or adapted? Interview people who are close to the individual, like teachers, family, and individuals. Do they see specific times and places where these behaviors are occurring? And if so, what happens before or after? And of course, the observation of students' behavior at different settings and different times during the day. Functional assessment methods have three distinct groups: direct observation, informant methods, and functional analysis. A direct observation is just that, where an observer watches the client directly when they engage in different activities within their natural environment. Activities like school, sports, or socializing with friends. They also observe when the problem of behavior occurs. They look at taking data for what happens just before and just after the event. The informant method includes interviews and questions that can be completed by the client themselves, teachers, parents, and other close relatives. These interviews and questions are used to assess what is happening before and after the target behavior occurs. From these informant methods, a hypothesis is also derived, and it's given on the reasons why the behavior occurs. Functional analysis is the only method that actually used to test the behavioral hypothesis and to predict when the behavior will occur. Different behavioral assessment methods include behavioral interviews, observational methods including naturalistic and controlled observations, controlled performance techniques, self-monitoring, role-playing, and cognitive behavioral assessment. Behavioral intervention plans are plans from data that has been collected during a functional behavioral assessment. Again, going back to the questions of when this happens, what causes it, are there any certain times of days, locations, or even interacting with specific people that trigger these behaviors. The data collected includes the function of the behavior, what happens and why is it happening, the frequency, how often it occurs, the severity of it, is it dangerous to them, others, or is it just a nuisance, and the consequence of these behaviors and the severity of the consequences. It also includes details and specific information about the target behavior and the goals of the behavior. There's also information about appropriate steps to take in order to decrease the inappropriate behaviors and increase a desired targeted behavior. Behavioral interviews are interviews that ask questions that focus on the targeted behavior. The goal of behavioral interviews is to help gain an overview of the problem behavior and any variables that increase this behavior. It's no different from a traditional interview in terms of the format that is being used. However, there is difference on the focus. Observation provides a sample of behavior to both a natural or controlled condition. There's fewer problems in research than in this therapy. The naturalistic approach is from home, school, in a hospital, or a therapy. A controlled condition is a situational test that depicts real-life situations. The controlled performance techniques are closely related to controlled observational methods. The observer will interfere more in this controlled observation. They ask more questions, they give more feedback, and they help with these situations. They don't really resemble real life, but they can heighten different aspects of your real life. Self-monitoring techniques, where the clients observe their own behaviors, emotions, and thoughts. This is when they look at what happens before, after, and even during the behavior, and usually keep notes. It's usually more a part of treatment than assessment because of the chance of bias. Role-playing. It's a controlled setting in terms for safety. It provides a scenario that the client will act out. The benefits of role-playing is that it allows for the patient to practice various scenarios and situations in a safe environment with continuous assessment and support. Another benefit of role-playing is the guided help. If someone gets stuck and doesn't know where to go in terms of how they handle their emotion or their behavior, the control can be helpful while you get help. You're able to stop the scenario and actually look at what is happening and how you can handle this more appropriately than just being in a real life situation where you act on emotion than really thinking about the consequences of your actions before they happen. Cognitive behavioral assessment is adding aspects of continuous and remembered thoughts, asking questions about one's behavior, their sleep, their appetite, and their decision making. The validity and reliability of a behavioral assessment test. The complexity of this behavior that is being observed. Is this behavior's complexity too complex for one person to help? Is there more than just one behavior that is needing to be addressed? The level of training and experience of the observer. Is the observer new? Are they able to handle the complexity of the behavior? Do they need help? Do they need other observers to rely on? The type of analysis chosen in the observation and the method of data that's being used. This can be a problem because if you're using the wrong method of observation and data collection, then you can skew your results. You might not get as effective results for the person because you're using a method that might not be beneficial. And any influence of observation on the target behavior. Are they getting influenced by peers to continue their behavior, even though it's a targeted behavior? Are they not getting the adequate help that they need for this behavior? What is the SORC model? Stimulus, organismic, response, and consequence. A stimulus is the antecedent factor that occurs before the behavior. What happens before? Is there something that sets this person off? Is it a room? Is it a person? Is it a class? Is it a subject? The organismic is the variables related to the target behavior. Again, the area that the child is in. The response is the target behavior.